The hardest hearts are broken by the gentlest touch. The coldest souls are warmed by the simplest smile. Sir Richard of Valehart was known as the Iron Knight, a man who served the crown without mercy or question. He collected taxes at sword point and crushed rebellion with ruthless efficiency. His heart had grown cold through years of war and duty. But in a starving village, a peasant girl named Clara would change everything. Despite having nothing, she offered him bread with trembling hands and smiled as if kindness still mattered. She tended to the sick with wilted herbs and refused to let hope die. This simple act of compassion toward the very man sent to take what little they had would melt the ice around Richard's heart. Can one girl's kindness truly transform a knight who's forgotten how to feel? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The steel blade gleamed in the morning light as Sir Richard of Valehart drew his father's sword from its scabbard. The weapon had been forged 3 generations ago, its crossguard bearing the family crest a hawk soaring above crossed swords. Every morning for the past 15 years, Richard had performed the same ritual, examining the blade for imperfections, checking the leather-wrapped grip, ensuring the weapon that had defined his lineage remained worthy of the Valehart name. The father, Sir Edmund of Valehart, had carried this sword through 7 campaigns along the northern borders before an enemy arrow found the gap in his armor during the siege of Greystone. Richard was barely 16 when the news reached their ancestral home, old enough to understand loss, young enough for it to reshape his very soul. The sword had returned with his father's personal effects, along with a letter from the king expressing gratitude for Sir Edmund's service and a promise that the family's loyalty would not be forgotten. That promise had become Richard's burden, and his purpose taught the castle of Ironhold, seat of House Valehart, perched on a granite cliff overlooking the valley where morning mist clung to ancient oak trees. From his chamber window, Richard could see the winding road that led through 3 villages before reaching the capital city of Aldermere. It was a road he traveled often now in service to King Aldric, carrying out duties that his father would have found distasteful but necessary. The kingdom had changed in the years since Edmund's death. Where once there had been prosperity and relative peace, now there was hunger and unrest. The northern wars had drained the royal treasury, and rebellions sprouted like weeds after rain in the outer provinces. Heavy taxation had become the crown's answer to every problem, and knights like Richard were expected to ensure compliance through whatever means necessary. Richard sheathed the sword and fastened the leather belt around his waist. His reflection in the polished steel mirror showed a man of 28 years, tall and lean with the corded muscle of a warrior. His dark hair was kept short in military fashion, and his gray eyes held the cold calculation that had earned him his reputation. Some called him handsome, but it was the harsh beauty of winter striking but unwelcoming. A knock at the chamber door interrupted his preparations. "Enter," he commanded, his voice carrying the authority of noble birth and years of command. Captain Marcus Blackwood stepped into the room, his weathered face bearing the scars of countless battles. Marcus had served under Richard's father and had become something approaching a friend to the younger knight, though their relationship remained formal by necessity. "Good morning, Sir Richard. The horses are ready, and the tax rolls have been prepared according to your instructions." "Very good, Marcus. How many villages today?" "3, my lord. Millhaven, Oakenford, and Thornwick. Millhaven reports particular difficulty meeting their obligations this quarter." Marcus hesitated, a flicker of something concern perhaps crossing his features. The harvest was poor throughout the valley, and there are reports of sickness among the livestock. Richard adjusted his gauntlets, each movement precise and economical. Difficulty is not an excuse for failure to meet royal obligations. The king's needs do not diminish because peasants claim hardship. He paused, noting Marcus's expression. "You disagree, Captain." The older man straightened his shoulders. "It is not my place to agree or disagree, Sir Richard. I serve at your command and yours at the Crown's." It was a diplomatic answer that revealed nothing and everything. Marcus had fought beside Richard's father, a man known for his fairness and compassion toward those under his protection. Richard knew that his own methods differed significantly from Edmund's approach, but sentiment was a luxury the kingdom could no longer afford. That the great hall of Ironhold bore the accumulated wealth and history of House Valehart. Tapestries depicting ancestral victories hung from stone walls, and the long dining table had hosted kings and nobles for 3 centuries. But the hall felt hollow now, its grandeur diminished by emptiness. Richard's mother had died in childbirth when he was 12, and his father's death had left him the sole heir to a legacy that sometimes felt more like a prison than a privilege. Lord Chancellor Aldwin Greycloak awaited him in the hall, his thin frame draped in the black robes of his office. Greycloak had been the king's advisor for 20 years, a man whose intelligence was matched only by his ruthless pragmatism. He rose from his chair near the great fireplace, the flames casting shadows across his gaunt features. "Sir Richard, I trust you are prepared for today's collections." Greycloak's voice carried the cultured accent of the capital, each word precisely enunciated. "His Majesty has expressed particular interest in the revenues from your district. The northern garrison requires additional funding, and certain investments in court have proven more expensive than anticipated." Richard nodded curtly. The king's gambling debts and the queen's fondness for exotic luxuries were poorly kept secrets among the nobility. "The villages will pay what they owe, Lord Chancellor. I give you my word. Of course they will." Greycloak smiled, the expression failing to reach his pale eyes. "Your reputation for efficiency precedes you. The Iron Knight, they call you. I find such respect for authority refreshing in these troubled times." The title rankled, though Richard would never show it. He had earned the name through his uncompromising enforcement of royal edicts, his refusal to accept excuses or grant extensions. Where other knights might show mercy for a widow struggling to pay her taxes or a farmer whose crops had failed, Richard collected what was owed. It was his duty, and duty was all that remained of his father's legacy that he could still honor. "I serve at His Majesty's pleasure," Richard replied, the formal response ending the conversation. The ride to Millhaven took 2 hours through countryside that had once been prosperous. Fields that should have been green with growing crops showed brown patches where drought and poor soil had taken their toll. Farmhouses that had once bustled with activity stood empty, their owners having fled to the cities in search of work or fallen victim to the diseases that followed hunger. Marcus rode beside him in companionable silence, their small escort of 6 men-at-arms following at a respectful distance. The soldiers wore the king's colors blue and gold and carried themselves with the professional bearing of career military men. They were good soldiers who followed orders without question, a quality Richard valued above all others. The road wound through a forest of ancient oaks and ash trees, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the morning sunlight into shifting patterns of gold and shadow. It was beautiful country, Richard acknowledged, though beauty had little value when measured against the practical needs of governance and defense. As they crested the final hill before Millhaven, the village spread below them like a collection of children's toys scattered across the valley floor. Thatched roof cottages clustered around a small stone church, their gardens and yards showing the meticulous care of people who knew that survival depended on making the most of what little they possessed. Smoke rose from a few chimneys, but not as many as there should have been. Too many houses stood empty, their windows dark and doors barred against wind and weather. The village well, which should have been surrounded by women drawing water and children playing, sat empty in the morning light. Richard felt a familiar tightness in his chest, Not compassion, he told himself, but professional disappointment at evidence of decline in his assigned territory. A village that couldn't sustain its population was a village that couldn't meet its tax obligations, and failure to collect adequate revenue reflected poorly on his competence as an administrator. "Sir Richard," Marcus said quietly, "perhaps we might consider the circumstances when—" "We will collect what is owed," Richard interrupted. "Nothing more, nothing less. The law makes no provisions for sentiment, Captain, and neither do I." As they rode into Millhaven, Richard's gray eyes swept the scene before him with practiced assessment. He noted the condition of the buildings, the state of the roads, the quality of the livestock he could see. All evidence pointed to a community struggling to survive. But struggle was not an excuse for failure to meet royal obligations. He had learned that lesson early, in the months after his father's death, when grief had threatened to overwhelm duty. Emotion was weakness, and weakness was luxury he could not afford. The Iron Knight had been forged in those dark months of learning to suppress everything that made him vulnerable, everything that might interfere with his ability to serve the crown as his father had died serving. The sword at his side seemed heavier as they approached the village center, its weight a reminder of all that he had inherited and all that he had chosen to sacrifice in service to duty. Soon, he would face the villagers who looked upon him with fear and resentment, and he would collect what was owed regardless of their circumstances or pleas. It was what his position required, and Richard of Valehart had never failed in his duty. The stench hit Richard first, a mixture of unwashed bodies, sickness, and despair that seemed to permeate the very air of Millhaven. As his party rode deeper into the village, the signs of suffering became impossible to ignore. Children with hollow cheeks and too large eyes peered from doorways before disappearing into the shadows of their homes. An elderly man leaned heavily on a walking stick, his frame so thin that his clothes hung like grave shrouds. Richard had seen poverty before, but this was different. This was a community dying slowly, one family at a time. The village elder, Thomas Millwright, emerged from the largest cottage near the well. His face bore the weathered dignity of a man who had worked with his hands for 60 years, but his shoulders sagged with burdens that went beyond physical labor. Behind him walked two other men, the blacksmith and the baker. Richard assumed from their appearance, both looking as though they would rather face an army than the Iron Knight. "Sir Richard," Thomas said, offering a bow that managed to convey respect without subservience. "We did not expect you so early in the season. The king's needs do not wait upon your convenience." "Elder," Richard replied, dismounting from his destrier with fluid grace. "I trust the village has prepared its tax assessment for the quarter." Thomas's weathered hands trembled slightly as he produced a roll of parchment from beneath his cloak. "We have, my lord, though I fear. Fear is not my concern. Facts are." Richard took the document and scanned its contents with practiced efficiency. The numbers told the story of a community barely sustaining itself. REPORTING grain stores that would last perhaps 2 months and livestock counts that had been halved since the previous year. From the corner of his eye, Richard noticed movement. Near the church, a young woman emerged from the building's side door, carrying a basket that seemed too heavy for her slight frame. She wore the rough homespun dress of a peasant, its brown fabric patched and mended with careful stitches. Her auburn hair was pulled back beneath a simple white cap, but several strands had escaped the frame of face that was striking. Despite, or perhaps because of its exhaustion, she moved with purpose toward a cottage where an elderly woman sat. Propped against the doorframe, her breathing labored and her skin bearing the gray pallor of illness. The young woman knelt beside her, drawing herbs from her basket and speaking in tones too low for Richard to hear, but gentle enough to soothe. "Who is that?" Richard asked, nodding toward the scene. Thomas followed his gaze. "Clara Whiteheart, my lord. She tends our sick when she can." Her mother was the village healer before the fever took her 2 winters past. Richard watched as Clara helped the elderly woman sip from a cup of what appeared to be herbal tea. The care in her movements, the patience with which she waited for each small sip, spoke of someone who had dedicated herself to easing suffering wherever she found it. And what qualifications does she possess for such work? Richard's question was sharp, reflecting his impatience with folk remedies and superstition. Knowledge passed down from her mother, and her mother before that, the blacksmith interjected. Clara has saved more lives in this village than— He stopped himself, perhaps realizing that contradicting a royal tax collector was unwise. Richard turned his attention back to the tax assessment, calculating the shortfall between what was owed and what the village claimed it could pay. The difference was significant, nearly 40% of the required amount. By law, he was authorized to seize goods, livestock, or even property to make up such deficiencies. "This assessment is unacceptable," he declared, his voice carrying across the small gathering that had formed around them. "The Crown requires full payment of taxes owed, not partial payments based on convenience." "Sir Richard," Thomas began, his voice carrying the desperate edge of a man watching his world crumble, "we have given what we can. The harvest failed, the livestock sickened, and many of our young men have left seeking work in the cities. We are doing everything possible. 2. Your difficulties do not reduce your obligations to the Crown." Richard's words were as cold as winter steel. "I will conduct a full inventory of village assets to determine what must be seized to satisfy your debt." A murmur of distress rippled through the gathered villagers. Richard saw fear in their faces, but also something else, a resignation that spoke of people who had endured too much for too long. They expected cruelty from their betters, and he was prepared to meet those expectations. As he turned to give orders to his men, Clara Whitehart approached from the cottage where she had been tending the sick woman. She moved without the deference shown by the other villagers, her green eyes meeting his directly. In her hands, she carried something wrapped in a clean cloth. "Sir Richard," she said, her voice steady despite the obvious fear in her community, "you have ridden far this morning. Perhaps you would accept some refreshment before beginning your work." She unwrapped the cloth to reveal a small loaf of brown bread, its crust golden and still warm from baking. The aroma that rose from it made Richard realized he had not broken his fast that morning, having been too focused on his duties to consider his own needs. "I do not require," he began, but Clara stepped closer, holding the bread out to him with hands that trembled only slightly. "Please," she said simply. "It is little enough to offer, but freely given." Richard stared at her, confused by the gesture. In his experience, peasants offered tribute out of fear or in hope of gaining favor. But Clara's expression held neither calculated servility nor desperate pleading. She was offering bread to a man who had come to take what little her village possessed, and she was doing it with a smile that seemed to come from some inexhaustible well of kindness. "Why?" he asked, the question emerging before he could stop. Clara's smile deepened, transforming her tired face into something luminous. "Because you are hungry, and I have bread. Is that not reason enough?" For a moment that stretched longer than it should have, Richard found himself unable to respond. No one had offered him anything without expecting something in return for longer than he could remember. Gifts to noble houses came with obligations. Meals were part of formal ceremonies, and even his servants' attentions were purchased with coin or compelled by duty. But this girl, this peasant who possessed nothing of value, was offering him bread with the same grace with which a queen might offer wine to an honored guest. Richard took the loaf, his gauntlet hands clumsy against the soft cloth wrapping. The bread was still warm, and he realized it must have come from her own meager stores. In a village facing famine, Clara Whitehart had given away food she could not afford to spare. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. Clara's smile brightened further. "You are most welcome, Sir Richard. I hope it serves you well." She turned to walk away, but Richard found himself calling after her. "Why do you help them? The sick, I mean. What do you gain from it?" Clara paused, looking back over her shoulder. "What does anyone gain from kindness, my lord? Perhaps the hope that kindness will return to us when we need it most." As she walked away, Richard stood holding her bread and feeling something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. Around him, the business of tax collection waited inventories to be taken, seizures to be made, royal obligations to be fulfilled. But, for the first time in years, duty felt like a burden rather than a purpose. He looked down at the bread in his hands, then up at Clara's retreating figure as she returned to her work among the sick and suffering. Something had shifted in the careful order of his world. Some fundamental assumption challenged by the simple act of a peasant girl sharing her bread with a knight who had come to take everything she possessed. The Iron Knight had faced enemy, armies and dangerous rebels without flinching. But Clara Whiteheart's smile had accomplished something that no weapon or threat had ever managed. It had made him question who he was and what he was becoming. 3 days had passed since Millhaven, and Richard found himself staring at the tax ledger spread across his desk with uncharacteristic indecision. The leather-bound book contained meticulous records of every village in his jurisdiction, every payment collected, and every seizure made in service to the crown. It was a document that should have brought him satisfaction, evidence of his efficiency and dedication to duty. Instead, it felt like a catalogue of suffering. His quill hovered over the entry for Millhaven, where he had recorded a collection amount. That was precisely half of what the village actually owed. The numbers stared back at him, written in his own careful script, documenting his first deliberate act of deception in service to the crown. He had told himself it was a practical decision. A village that starved to death could pay no taxes at all, while one that survived might eventually return to full productivity. It was an investment in future revenue, nothing more. The bread Clara had given him had been consumed on the ride. Back to Ironhold, but its taste seemed to linger in his memory, along with the inexplicable warmth of her smile. Knock at his chamber door interrupted his brooding. "Enter," he called. Closing the ledger with perhaps more force than necessary, Captain Marcus stepped into the room, his weathered face bearing an expression of carefully controlled concern. "Sir Richard, Lord Chancellor Greycloak, has arrived from the capital. He requests an immediate audience to review this quarter's collections." Richard felt his jaw tighten. Greycloak's visits were never social calls, and his timing suggested he had heard reports about Millhaven's reduced payment. Has he stated his specific concerns? "No, my lord, but he was accompanied by 2 clerks carrying account books from the royal treasury." Marcus paused, studying Richard's face with the familiarity of long service. "Sir Richard, if there are any irregularities in the collections—" "There are no irregularities, Captain." The lie came easily, but it left a bitter taste in Richard's mouth. "Inform Lord Chancellor Greycloak that I will attend him in the great hall within the hour." Marcus nodded and withdrew, but Richard noticed the way the older man's eyes lingered on the closed ledger. The captain had served 2 generations of House Valehart, and his loyalty was beyond question. But he was also observant enough to notice changes in his lord's behavior. Richard spent the next hour preparing for what would likely be an unpleasant conversation. He reviewed his records, rehearsed explanations for Millhaven's reduced payment, and tried to convince himself that his decision had been strategically sound rather than emotionally motivated. Lord Chancellor Greycloak waited in the great hall with the patience of a spider in its web. His pale eyes missed nothing as they catalogued the ancient tapestries, the polished weapons displayed on the walls, and the family portraits that documented 3 centuries of Valehart's service to the crown. "Sir Richard," Greycloak said, rising from his chair with fluid grace. "How good of you to receive me on such short notice." I trust your recent collections have proceeded smoothly? They have, Lord Chancellor. Each village has contributed according to its capacity. Richard chose his words carefully, threading the needle between truth and deception. Greycloak smiled, the expression as cold as winter moonlight. Capacity is such a flexible concept, is it not? I have been reviewing the reports from your district, and I noticed some interesting variations in collection amounts. He gestured to one of his clerks, who produced a scroll containing detailed financial records. Millhaven, for instance, shows a significant reduction from previous quarters. Given that village's strategic location and agricultural resources, such a decline seems unexpected. Richard felt the familiar weight of his father's sword at his side, but for the first time, it offered no comfort. Millhaven has suffered from poor harvests and livestock disease. Their reduced payment reflects economic reality rather than any failure of enforcement. I see. Greycloak's tone suggested he saw rather more than Richard was comfortable with. And you felt it was within your authority to make such adjustments without consultation with the royal treasury. The question hung in the air between them like a blade. Richard recognized the trap admit to unauthorized mercy and face charges of exceeding his authority, or claim the reduced collection was justified and invite detailed scrutiny of his methods. I collected what could be reasonably extracted without destroying the village's future productivity. Richard said finally, a village that starves cannot pay taxes. Greycloak nodded slowly, as if considering this explanation. Practical thinking, to be certain. Yet His Majesty's immediate needs are pressing, and sentiment, however well-intentioned, cannot be allowed to compromise royal revenue. The Lord Chancellor began pacing the length of the great hall, his footsteps echoing off the stone walls. Tell me, Sir Richard, what is your assessment of Millhaven's actual capacity to pay? Not what they claim they can afford, but what they actually possess. Richard found himself thinking of Clara's bread, of the warmth in her eyes as she offered it despite having so little herself. He thought of the elderly woman she had been tending, of the hollow-cheeked children who had watched his arrival with fear and resignation. They have paid what they can, he said. Have they? Greycloak stopped pacing and fixed Richard with a stare that seemed to strip away pretense. My sources suggest otherwise. Reports indicate the village maintains hidden grain stores and that several families possess valuable items that could be seized to satisfy their obligations. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. Greycloak had been having Millhaven watched, had agents gathering intelligence on the very people Clara was struggling to help survive. Sir Richard, Greycloak continued, his voice taking on a tone of paternal concern, I understand the challenges of your position. Effective tax collection requires a certain emotional distance from those being taxed. Perhaps your father's reputation for kindness has created unrealistic expectations among the peasantry. The mention of his father sparked something dangerous in Richard's chest. Edmund of Valehart had been beloved by his people because he had understood that true strength lay in protecting those who could not protect themselves, not in grinding them beneath the wheel of royal necessity. My father served the crown faithfully, Richard said, his voice carefully controlled. Indeed, he did, and died for that service. But times have changed, Sir Richard. The kingdom faces threats that require difficult choices. Sentiment is a luxury we can no longer afford. Greycloak moved to the window that overlooked the valley where Millhaven lay hidden among the hills. I will be conducting my own assessment of that village's capacity to pay. I trust you will cooperate fully with my investigation. The threat was clear. Richard could either assist in squeezing additional revenue from Millhaven's suffering populace, or face questions about his competence and loyalty to the crown. Of course, Lord Chancellor, Richard replied, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. But even as he spoke, Richard found himself thinking of Clara's smile and the inexplicable peace he had felt when she offered him bread with no expectation of return. For the first time in his adult life, duty and conscience were pulling him in opposite directions. The Iron Knight had always prided himself on his unwavering loyalty to the crown, but Clara Whiteheart had shown him something that cut deeper than duty, the quiet strength of compassion offered without calculation or expectation. As Lord Chancellor Greycloak outlined his plans for extracting additional revenue from Millhaven, Richard made a decision that would have shocked his younger self. He would return to the village before Greycloak arrived, ostensibly to prepare for the Lord Chancellor's investigation. But his true purpose would be to warn Clara and the others of what was coming. Richard rode to Millhaven alone, having dismissed Captain Marcus with orders to prepare for Lord Chancellor Greycloak's inspection. The morning mist clung to the valley like a shroud, and the road seemed longer than he remembered. With each mile, the weight of his deception grew heavier, but so did his resolve to protect the village from what was coming. He found Clara where he had expected, kneeling beside a crude wooden bed where a child lay fevered and still. The cottage was small and poorly furnished, its single room serving as both living space and makeshift infirmary. 3 other patients occupied pallets on the floor, their breathing labored and their faces bearing the pallor of serious illness. Clara looked up as his shadow fell across the doorway, and for a moment her face showed surprise rather than the fear he was accustomed to seeing in peasant eyes. She wore the same patched brown dress, but he noticed now that it had been carefully mended with thread of a slightly different color, each repair done with meticulous care. "Sir Richard," she said, rising from beside the child's bed with fluid grace, "I did not expect to see you again so soon." "I bring news that cannot wait," he said, stepping into the cottage and immediately feeling the oppressive heat of too many bodies in too small a space. "Lord Chancellor Greycloak arrives tomorrow with authority to conduct a full assessment of village assets. He believes Millhaven is concealing resources." Clara's hands stilled on the herb-stained cloth she had been using to cool the child's fever. "And what do you believe, my lord?" The question caught him off guard with its directness. In his world, peasants did not ask knights what they believed. They accepted what they were told and hoped for mercy. "I believe," Richard said carefully, "that appearances can be deceiving." A small smile played at the corners of Clara's mouth. "Indeed they can. The Iron Knight who comes bearing warnings is not at all what he appears to be." Richard felt heat rise in his cheeks. "I am not. That is, I merely thought it prudent to ensure proper procedures are followed." "Of course." Clara turned back to her patient, but her tone suggested she understood more about his motivations than he was comfortable admitting. "Will you tell me what proper procedures require?" Richard found himself studying the cottage's sparse furnishings as he spoke. A single table bore Clara's collection of herbs and healing supplies, their earthy scents mingling with the smell of sickness and poverty. Clay pots held preparations he could not identify, and bundles of dried plants hung from the rafters like small talismans against suffering. Greycloak will inventory everything of value: livestock, grain stores, tools, personal possessions. Anything that could be sold or traded will be assessed for seizure. Richard paused, watching Clara's face for signs of despair or panic. Instead, he saw only thoughtful calculation. "I see. And what value would the Lord Chancellor place on a sick child's life, or an elderly woman's dignity?" The questions were not accusations, but they struck Richard like physical blows. In his careful recitation of legal procedures, he had reduced human suffering to a matter of administrative efficiency. "The law makes no provisions for such considerations," he said, the words feeling hollow even as he spoke them. Clara nodded, accepting this explanation with the same grace she had shown when offering him bread. She moved to check on the elderly woman who had been her patient during his previous visit, and Richard was struck by the gentle competence of her movements. "May I ask about your training?" he said, surprising himself with the question. "Your knowledge of healing arts?" Clara's hands paused in their work, and when she looked at him, her green eyes held depths he had not previously noticed. My mother was the village healer before me, and her mother before that. They taught me that suffering calls to those who would ease it, regardless of station or circumstance. She moved to a shelf where clay pots contained various preparations, selecting one with practiced familiarity. This is willow bark tea for pain, this chamomile for sleep and calm nerves, this elderberry for fever. Her voice carried the quiet pride of someone sharing knowledge hard-won through years of careful observation. But surely you know such remedies cannot compete with trained physicians? Clara smiled, but there was sadness in the expression. Trained. Physicians require payment we cannot provide, Sir Richard. The choice is not between my poor skills and learned medicine. It is between my poor skills and no aid at all. From beneath her rough dress, Clara drew a small object that caught the light filtering through the cottage's single window. It was a copper ring, simple and unadorned, worn smooth by years of handling. This was my mother's, she said, turning the ring between her fingers. She wore it every day for 30 years, tending the sick and helping with difficult births. When the fever took her, she made me promise to continue her work. Clara looked up at Richard, her expression serious, but unafraid. I cannot heal everyone, my lord, but I can try. Is that not enough? Richard found himself staring at the ring, struck by the weight of legacy it represented. Like his father's sword, it was an inheritance that carried both honor and obligation. But where his inheritance had led him toward coldness and duty, Clara's had led her toward warmth and service. It is more than enough, he said, the admission surprising him with its honesty. Clara slipped the ring back beneath her dress, but not before Richard glimpsed the careful way she touched it, a gesture of remembrance and resolve that spoke of love transcending death. Sir Richard, she said, returning to her patient's bedside, may I ask why you warned us of Lord Chancellor Greycloak's visit? Surely your duty lies in ensuring efficient tax collection. The question hung between them, like a bridge that could be crossed or burned. Richard realized that his answer would define not only how Clara saw him, but how he saw himself. Because, he said slowly, I have begun to question whether efficient tax collection and just governance are the same thing. Clara's smile transformed her face, revealing a beauty that had nothing to do with physical features and everything to do with the light that seemed to emanate from her very being. Then perhaps the Iron Knight's heart is not as frozen as people believe. As Richard prepared to leave the cottage, Clara pressed something into his hands, a small bundle wrapped in clean cloth. Herbs for headaches, she explained. I imagine the weight of difficult decisions might cause such discomfort. Richard accepted the gift, his fingers brushing hers for a moment that seemed to last far longer than it should have. Her hands were callous from work, but warm with life, and he found himself reluctant to break the contact. Thank you, he said, meaning far more than gratitude for herbal remedies. As he mounted his horse for the ride back to Ironhold, Richard carried with him the image of Clara, tending her patients with infinite patience and compassion. He also carried the growing certainty that Lord Chancellor Greycloak's visit would force him to choose between the duty that had defined his life and the conscience that Clara's kindness had awakened. The Iron Knight was discovering that some battles could not be won with sword and strategy alone. The coded message arrived with the dawn, carried by a travel-worn messenger whose nervous eyes never quite met Richard's gaze. The parchment bore the royal seal, but the contents were written in the cipher used for sensitive intelligence reports. Richard dismissed the messenger with coins and a warning about discretion, then retreated to his private chambers to decode the troubling words. Rebel activity confirmed in eastern districts. Armed groups gathering near border settlements. Suspected collaboration between insurgents and local populations. Immediate investigation and suppression authorized. Full discretionary powers granted. Report findings directly to throne. Richard read the message 3 times, each reading deepening his growing unease. The eastern districts included Millhaven and the surrounding villages, communities that had shown no signs of rebellion beyond a quiet desperation of people struggling to survive. Yet as he considered the implications, fragments of memory began to coalesce into an uncomfortable pattern. The reduced population in several villages. The nervous glances exchanged between villagers when tax collectors arrived. The way conversations stopped when knights appeared. What he had interpreted as fear of authority might have been something more deliberate. The careful silence of people concealing dangerous secrets. A second knock interrupted his brooding. Captain Marcus entered at his command, his weathered face bearing news that Richard suspected he would not wish to hear. "Sir Richard, scouts report unusual activity along the northern road. Armed men moving in small groups, avoiding main settlements, but gathering near the old watchtower ruins. They carry no banners and scatter when approached." Richard set down the decoded message, his mind already calculating distances and strategic implications. The watchtower ruins lay less than a day's ride from Millhaven, positioned to overlook the main trade routes through the valley. "How many men?" "Difficult to determine, my lord. Our scouts estimate perhaps 30 to 40, but they move in groups of 5 or 6. Professional soldiers by their bearing and equipment." Marcus paused, studying Richard's expression. "Sir Richard, these rebels, if rebels they are, show tactical knowledge. They're not farmers with pitchforks." The intelligence aligned uncomfortably with the coded message. Richard found himself thinking of Clara's village, of the careful way Thomas Millwright had spoken about hardships, of the empty houses that might have concealed more than poverty. "Prepare a patrol," Richard ordered. "We ride to investigate these reports personally." "Sir Richard, perhaps it would be wiser to send a larger force. If these are indeed trained rebels, a larger force would be seen for miles and accomplish nothing but driving them deeper underground." Richard moved to the window that overlooked the valley, his gray eyes scanning the landscape with new wariness. "I need information, Captain, not a pitched battle that might spark the very uprising we're trying to prevent." 2 hours later, Richard led a small party of 6 men-at-arms through the winding forest paths that approached the watchtower ruins from the west. The ancient structure had once guarded the valley approaches, but years of neglect had reduced it to crumbling stone walls and a partially collapsed tower that offered concealment for anyone willing to risk its unstable floors. They dismounted a quarter-mile from the ruins and approached on foot, moving with the practiced stealth of men trained in reconnaissance. Richard's hand rested on his father's sword, but he found his thoughts turning repeatedly to Clara's gentle smile and her philosophy of kindness offered without expectation of return. The contrast between her world and this one where armed men, gathered in secret and kingdoms teetered on the edge of civil war, struck him with uncomfortable force. Clara tended the sick with herbs and hope, while he tracked potential rebels through morning shadows with steel and suspicion. As they crested the final ridge, Richard saw movement among the ruins. Men in dark clothing moved with military precision, posting guards and conducting what appeared to be a planning session around makeshift maps spread on fallen stones. Their equipment was better than he had expected, real weapons rather than farm tools. Mailed beneath their cloaks, horses hobbled in a concealed ravine. Richard gestured for his men to remain hidden while he studied the scene below. The rebels' leader appeared to be a tall man with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. When he turned to address his followers, Richard caught sight of a scarred face that sparked recognition. Sir Garrett Blackthorne, a knight who had served with distinction until disappearing 3 years earlier, following a dispute with the royal court over taxation policies. The sight of a former royal knight leading what was clearly an organized rebellion changed everything. This was not peasant unrest or local banditry, but a coordinated challenge to royal authority led by someone who understood military strategy and possessed the training to implement it effectively. Richard watched as Blackthorn pointed to locations on his map, assigning groups to what appeared to be specific targets. The rebels' discipline and organization suggested they had been planning this operation for months, gathering intelligence and recruiting supporters throughout the eastern districts. As the meeting concluded, and the rebels began dispersing in small groups, Richard made a decision that would have profound consequences. Rather than returning immediately to report his findings, he chose to follow one group that was heading toward Millhaven. The rebels moved carefully through forest paths that avoided main roads, their route suggesting intimate knowledge of local terrain. Richard and his men shadowed them at a distance, using their own military training to remain undetected while gathering intelligence about rebel numbers and capabilities. As afternoon shadows lengthened, the rebel group approached Millhaven from the north, using a hunter's trail that Richard had not known existed. They moved with the confidence of men familiar with their destination, and when they reached the village outskirts, they were met by a figure that made Richard's blood run. Cold. Thomas Millwright emerged from a grove of oak trees, greeting the rebels not as strangers, but as expected allies. The village elder's conversation with the rebel leader was too distant to overhear, but their familiarity suggested an established relationship. Richard felt the world shift beneath him as implications crystallized with terrible clarity. Millhaven's reduced tax payments, the nervous behavior of villagers during his visits, the empty houses that might have concealed supplies or weapons rather than simply representing population decline. Clara's own nervousness when he had warned her about Lord Chancellor Greycloak's investigation, the village he had begun to care about, the people he had risked his position to protect, were collaborating with armed rebels against the crown he had sworn to serve. As he watched Thomas Millwright hand the rebels a bundle that might have contained supplies or intelligence, Richard faced a moment of truth that would define the rest of his life. His duty as a royal knight demanded he report this treasonous activity immediately, leading to arrests, executions, and the destruction of Millhaven as an example to other potential rebels. But Clara's face rose in his memory, her gentle hands tending the sick, her smile as she offered bread to a man who had come to take everything she possessed, her mother's ring worn as a reminder that love could transcend death and inspire service to others. Richard closed his eyes and made a choice that the Iron Knight would never have contemplated. He would return to Ironhold and report that his investigation had found no evidence of rebel activity in the eastern districts. The coded message would receive a reply stating that rumors of insurgent collaboration had proven unfounded, and that increased taxation pressure had created the appearance of unrest. Where none actually existed. It was treason of the highest order. But as Richard led his men away from Millhaven without confronting the rebels or their village collaborators, he found that his conscience felt lighter than it had in years. Clara Whiteheart had shown him that true strength lay not in blind obedience to authority, but in protecting those who could not protect themselves. Even if they were rebels fighting against the crown he served, they were still people deserving of compassion and mercy. The Iron Knight was discovering that some loyalties ran deeper than duty, and some truths mattered more than law. Richard's deception weighed heavily on his mind as he composed his false report to the royal court. Each carefully chosen word felt like another step away from the man he had been, but also towards someone he was not yet certain he wished to become. The letter stated that rebel rumors had proven exaggerated, that increased taxation had created unrest but not organized resistance, and that continued vigilance would prevent any genuine insurgency from taking root. He sealed the message with his personal signet ring, the Valehart hawk pressing into warm wax like a signature on his own transformation. But as he prepared to dispatch the report, a commotion in the castle courtyard drew his attention to the window. Clara Whiteheart stood before the main gate, her simple brown dress marking her as distinctly out of place among the stone walls and martial banners of Ironhold. She carried a leather satchel and spoke earnestly with the gate guards, who seemed uncertain how to respond to a peasant woman requesting audience with their lord. Richard descended to the courtyard with a mixture of anticipation and concern. Clara's presence at his stronghold could only mean something had gone wrong in Millhaven, and given what he now knew about the village's connections to the rebellion, her arrival might herald disaster for them both. "Sir Richard," Clara said, offering a respectful curtsy that somehow managed to convey dignity rather than subservience. "Forgive the presumption of my visit, but I bring urgent news that could not wait for your next collection rounds." The gate guards withdrew at Richard's gesture, leaving them alone in the courtyard, where morning shadows provided some privacy from observing eyes. Clara appeared nervous but determined, her green eyes holding secrets that made Richard's pulse quicken with apprehension. "What news?" he asked, keeping his voice carefully neutral. Clara glanced around the courtyard, ensuring they could not be overheard. "There are injured men hidden in our village, Sir Richard. Wounded soldiers who came seeking aid in the night. I have been tending their injuries, but their conditions are serious, and my skills may not be sufficient." Richard felt his world tilt as understanding dawned. Clara was telling him about the rebels, not revealing their presence as a loyal subject reporting suspicious activity, but seeking medical assistance for wounded insurgents. "And you believe I should know of this because—" Clara stepped closer, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Because one of them spoke your name, Sir Richard. He said you had been watching their movements, but chose not to report what you saw. He said you allowed them to escape when you could have captured them." The words hit Richard like physical blows. The rebels knew about his surveillance and his decision to remain silent. More importantly, Clara knew that he knew about their activities and had chosen not to act against them. "I am not certain what you are suggesting," Richard said carefully. Clara's expression softened into something that might have been understanding or pity. "I am suggesting, my lord, that perhaps the Iron Knight's heart is not as frozen as his reputation claims, and that a man capable of such mercy might be willing to help heal those he chose not to harm." She opened her leather satchel and withdrew a small journal bound in cracked leather. Its pages were filled with careful handwriting documenting herb preparations, healing techniques, and treatment protocols passed down through generations of village healers. "This was my mother's," Clara said, offering the journal to Richard. "It contains everything she learned about treating serious injuries, sword wounds, broken bones, infections that threaten life. But the knowledge is useless without proper supplies." Richard accepted the journal, his fingers tracing the worn leather binding. The pages fell open to detailed illustrations of anatomical structures and healing procedures that spoke of knowledge accumulated through years of desperate necessity. "What exactly are you asking of me?" Clara's answer came without hesitation, as if she had been preparing for this conversation since deciding to make the journey to Ironhold. "I am asking you to help me save lives, Sir Richard. The wounded men in our village will die without proper medical supplies, clean bandages, surgical instruments, medicines that I cannot obtain through normal means. You are asking me to provide aid to rebels against the crown. I am asking you to provide aid to human beings who are suffering." Clara's voice carried quiet conviction that reminded Richard of his father's unwavering moral certainty. Their political affiliations do not make their pain less real or their need for healing less urgent. Richard found himself staring into Clara's eyes, seeing there the same compassion that had moved her to offer bread to a tax collector, the same gentle strength that drove her to tend the sick despite having so little to offer. She was asking him to risk everything, his position, his family's honor, possibly his life, to help people who were technically his enemies. "If I were to consider such assistance," he said slowly, "what assurance would I have that these men are not dangerous criminals who would use my aid to harm innocent people?" Clara's smile held sadness that spoke of too much experience with the complexities of human nature. I can offer no such assurance, Sir Richard. I can only tell you that injured men who cry out for their mothers in pain and fever seem very much like any other suffering souls in need of healing. The simple humanity of her observation struck Richard with unexpected force. In his mental calculations of political loyalty and strategic advantage, he had forgotten that rebels were also sons, brothers, fathers, men whose motivations might be as complex as his own. "There is something else," Clara continued, her voice dropping even lower. "One of the wounded men carries a message meant for someone in the capital. He believes the person he seeks might be sympathetic to their cause, someone highly placed who can help prevent the conflict from escalating into open civil war." Richard felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to align in disturbing patterns. "Who is this person?" "I do not know, but the wounded man speaks of someone called the conscience of the court, someone who has grown troubled by the kingdom's direction and might be willing to work for peaceful resolution of grievances." The phrase sent a chill through Richard as he recognized court gossip about a mysterious figure who had been questioning royal policies and advocating for reform. Rumors suggested this person held significant influence and had been working quietly to moderate the king's more extreme measures. "Clara," Richard said, his voice heavy with the weight of decisions that seemed to multiply with each moment. "Do you understand what you are asking? The risks involved for both of us?" Her answer came without hesitation, accompanied by a smile that transformed her tired face into something luminous. "I understand that some risks are worth taking, Sir Richard. My mother taught me that healing is not just about herbs and bandages. It is about choosing hope over fear, compassion over indifference." She reached beneath her dress and withdrew the simple copper ring that had belonged to her mother, holding it up so the morning light caught its worn surface. "This ring reminds me that love is stronger than death, that service to others gives meaning to our brief time in this world. If helping wounded men risks my life, then perhaps that risk is the price of living a life worth having." As Richard stood in his family's courtyard, holding Clara's healing journal and facing the most important decision of his life, he realized that the Iron Knight's transformation was already complete. The only question now was whether he had the courage to embrace who he had become. The trap closed around Richard with the precision of a master strategist who had been watching his every move for weeks. He returned to Ironhold from his clandestine mission to deliver medical supplies to Millhaven, believing his deception remained undiscovered, only to find Sir Gareth Ironwolf waiting in the great hall with a company of royal guards. Gareth stood beside the massive fireplace where Richard's ancestors had planned campaigns and celebrated victories, but his presence transformed the familiar space into an arena of judgment. The knight was younger than Richard by several years, with the golden hair and perfect features that made him a favorite at court. More importantly, he possessed the ruthless ambition that had earned him rapid advancement in royal service. "Sir Richard of Valehart," Gareth announced as Richard entered the hall, his voice carrying the formal cadence of official proceedings. "By order of His Majesty King Aldric, you are hereby detained on charges of treason against the crown." Richard's hand moved instinctively toward his father's sword, but the presence of 8 armed guards made resistance futile. Captain Marcus stood among them, his weathered face bearing an expression of profound anguish that spoke volumes about how this betrayal had unfolded. "On what evidence?" Richard demanded, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Gareth smiled with the satisfaction of a hunter who had tracked his quarry to ground. "Evidence provided by loyal subjects who observed your treasonous activities. Specifically, your failure to report rebel activity in your assigned district, your deliberate falsification of tax collection records, and your provision of aid and comfort to enemies of the realm." The charges were accurate in every detail, which meant someone had been watching Richard's movements with meticulous care. As Gareth continued his recitation of crimes, Richard found himself thinking not of his own fate, but of Clara and the wounded men she was hiding. If his activities had been observed, the village might already be under attack. Furthermore, Gareth announced, producing a document bearing the royal seal, investigation has revealed additional evidence of your treasonous nature that may surprise even you, Sir Richard. The parchment crackled as Gareth unfolded it with theatrical precision. This is a genealogical record maintained by the royal court, documenting certain unofficial relationships that have bearing on matters of succession and inheritance. Richard felt the world shift beneath him as understanding began to dawn. Gareth's smile widened as he continued his revelation. It appears that your father, Sir Edmund of Valehart, was not the only one to serve His Majesty in intimate ways. Your mother, Lady Catherine, enjoyed the king's favor during her brief marriage to Sir Edmund. You, Sir Richard, are not merely a knight in service to the crown. You are the bastard son of King Aldric himself. The words hit Richard like physical blows, reordering everything he thought he knew about his identity and place in the world. Images flooded his memory with new meaning, his mother's occasional sadness when she thought herself unobserved, his father's careful distance during Richard's early years, the way certain courtiers had always treated him with deference that exceeded his official rank. His Majesty, Gareth continued, has been aware of this relationship for some time. Your appointment to tax collection duties, your rapid advancement, your freedom to operate with minimal oversight, all were expressions of royal favor toward his unacknowledged offspring. Richard found his voice through the shock of revelation. If this is true, then why? Why are you being arrested for treason? Gareth's expression grew cold with satisfaction. Because His Majesty has concluded that blood alone is insufficient to guarantee loyalty. Your recent activities have demonstrated that you lack the necessary ruthlessness to serve the crown effectively. The royal guards moved closer as Gareth delivered his final revelation. However, His Majesty is prepared to offer clemency in exchange for a demonstration of your renewed commitment to royal service. You will lead a punitive expedition against the rebel strongholds you previously failed to report, beginning with the complete destruction of Millhaven as an example to other potential insurgents. The demand struck Richard like a blow to the chest. King Aldric was offering to spare his life in exchange for destroying the village where Clara lived, where wounded men lay hidden in desperate need of continued care, where people had shown him kindness despite his role as their oppressor. And if I refuse, Gareth's smile turned predatory. Then you will be executed for treason at dawn, and Sir Gareth Ironwolf will lead the expedition in your place. The village will burn regardless. Sir Richard, but your cooperation would allow you to survive to serve your father, your true father, in future campaigns. The trap was elegantly constructed, offering Richard a choice between personal survival and moral integrity. King Aldric had maneuvered him into a position where saving his own life required destroying everything that had begun to matter to him. As Richard stood surrounded by royal guards in the hall, where generations of his family had served the crown with honor, he realized that his entire understanding of duty and loyalty had been built on lies. The father he had revered was not his father. The king he had served was the man who had dishonored his mother and used their illegitimate relationship to manipulate his service. But Clara's face rose in his memory, her gentle smile as she offered bread, her steady hands tending the wounded, her mother's ring worn as a reminder that love could transcend death and inspire service to others. She had shown him that true honor lay not in blind obedience to authority, but in protecting those who could not protect themselves. I require time to consider your offer, Richard said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his mind. Gareth nodded with apparent magnanimity. His Majesty anticipated such a request. You have until dawn to reach your decision. Captain Marcus will escort you to suitable quarters where you may contemplate the wisdom of continued loyalty to the crown. As the guards surrounded him, Richard caught Marcus's eye and saw there not condemnation but profound sorrow. The old captain had served 2 generations of House Valehart with unwavering devotion, and Richard's arrest represented the end of an era that had defined both their lives. "Captain," Richard said quietly as they left the great hall, "whatever happens, remember that duty to one's conscience sometimes conflicts with duty to one's superiors." Marcus nodded almost imperceptibly, understanding passing between them that transcended words. The old soldier had watched Richard's transformation from cold efficiency to something approaching compassion, and while he might not approve of treason, he could recognize the moral courage that had inspired it. In the tower chamber, where he was confined to await dawn and decision, Richard sat beside the narrow window that overlooked the valley where Millhaven lay hidden among the hills. Somewhere in that village, Clara was tending wounded rebels with supplies he had provided at the cost of his own safety. She was risking her life to heal men whose cause had become more important to her than her own survival. The irony was not lost on him. He had begun this journey as the Iron Knight, a man whose heart had been frozen by duty and loss. Clara's simple act of offering bread had started a thaw that now threatened to destroy everything he had been while offering the possibility of becoming someone better. As stars appeared in the darkening sky, Richard made his decision. He would not purchase his life with Clara's death or destroy the village that had shown him the meaning of compassion. Whatever the cost, he would find a way to protect the people who had taught him that mercy was not weakness, but the highest form of strength. The Iron Knight's transformation was complete, but Sir Richard of Valehart, bastard son of kings and friend to rebels, was just beginning to understand who he might become. Dawn would bring his answer to the king's ultimatum, but the choice had already been made in the moment. Clara smiled and offered bread to a man who had come to take everything she possessed. Some betrayals were acts of honor, and some treason served a higher loyalty than law. The rescue came at midnight, executed with the precision that only years of military training could provide. Captain Marcus appeared at Richard's tower window like a ghost, having climbed the outer wall using rope and grappling hooks with an agility that belied his age. Behind him came 2 of Richard's most trusted men-at-arms, soldiers whose loyalty to House Valehart transcended their oath to the crown. "Sir Richard," Marcus whispered as he slipped through the narrow window, "we must move quickly. The guard rotation changes in 10 minutes, and Sir Gareth has posted sentries throughout the castle." Richard needed no further urging. The hours of confinement had been spent not in agonized deliberation, but in careful planning. His decision to reject the king's ultimatum had been made the moment he understood the choice before him, and the time since had been devoted to considering how best to protect Clara and Millhaven from the consequences of his defiance. "The horses?" Richard asked as he gathered his few possessions, including his father's sword and the healing journal Clara had entrusted to him. "Waiting in the grove beyond the eastern wall," reported Sergeant Willem, one of the men-at-arms who had served Richard since his appointment to tax collection duties. "Food, weapons, and supplies for a week's travel. But Sir Richard, once we leave Ironhold, there can be no return. We will be outlaws, branded as traitors to the crown." Richard paused in his preparations, studying the faces of the 3 men who were risking everything to help him escape. Marcus bore the weathered dignity of a career soldier whose loyalty had transferred from father to son across decades of service. Willem and his companion, Sergeant Bors, were younger men who had found in Richard's recent transformation an echo of the honor they had hoped to serve when they first took their oaths. "I will not ask you to follow me into exile and disgrace," Richard said quietly. "Your service to House Valehart has been beyond reproach, and you owe me nothing that would justify sharing my fate." Marcus answered for all of them, his voice carrying the conviction of a man who had spent a lifetime distinguishing between orders worth following and principles worth dying for. "Sir Richard, I served your father for 15 years and watched him choose honor over advantage in every decision that mattered. You are more his son than you know. And if serving you means standing against tyranny disguised as law, then we stand with you gladly." The escape from Ironhold required every skill Richard had learned in years of military training. They descended the tower wall in darkness, moved through shadows to avoid posted sentries, and reached the appointed grove without raising alarm. 4 horses waited in the concealment of ancient oak trees, along with supplies that spoke of careful planning and deep loyalty. As they rode through the night toward Millhaven, Richard found himself thinking of the rebel banner that Clara had described, a simple cloth flag bearing symbols of justice rather than royal arms. He had spent his adult life serving heraldry that represented power and privilege, but perhaps it was time to follow symbols that stood for something nobler. The journey to Millhaven took 6 hours through forest paths that avoided main roads and royal patrols. Dawn was breaking over the valley as they approached the village from the north, using the same hunter's trail that Richard had observed rebels employing during his surveillance. They found Millhaven in a state of careful preparation that spoke of people who had been expecting trouble. Men moved through the village with purposeful efficiency, concealing livestock and valuable goods while positioning themselves to defend their homes. Women gathered children into the most defensible buildings, their faces bearing the grim determination of people who had accepted that survival would require courage. Clara met them at the village center, her simple brown dress replaced by practical clothing more suitable for the crisis at hand. But her smile was unchanged, warm, welcoming, and completely without the fear that Richard had expected to see given the circumstances. "Sir Richard," she said, offering him a cup of steaming tea that smelled of herbs and hope. "Thomas said you might come, but I confess I had hoped you would choose safety over whatever this is." "Safety has never felt less appealing," Richard replied, accepting the tea and finding comfort in its familiar warmth. "Clara, you must know that royal forces will arrive before midday. Sir Gareth Airwolf commands them, and he has orders to make an example of this village." Clara nodded, her expression serious but unafraid. "We know. The wounded men you helped us treat brought word of developments at court. They also brought something else, allies who share your desire to prevent unnecessary bloodshed." She led Richard toward the village church, where a gathering that would have been impossible to imagine just weeks earlier was taking place. Thomas Millwright stood beside Sir Garrett Blackthorne, the former royal knight who now commanded the local rebel forces. Near them waited a figure who made Richard's breath catch in surprise: Lord Commander Julian Ashford, one of the most respected military leaders in the kingdom. Ashford's presence transformed everything. The man was legendary for his tactical brilliance and unwavering honor, but he had disappeared from court 6 months earlier, following rumored disagreements with royal policy. His graying hair and scarred face bore witness to decades of service to the crown, but his eyes held the same moral certainty that Richard had come to associate with Clara's quiet strength. "Sir Richard of Valehart," Ashford said, extending his hand in greeting rather than demanding the deference his rank traditionally required. "Sir Garrett has told me of your recent evolution in thinking about duty and justice. I confess myself curious about what brought the Iron Knight to our cause." Richard found himself looking at Clara as he answered, drawing strength from her encouraging smile. "I learned that true honor sometimes requires choosing conscience over orders, my lord. A peasant girl taught me that compassion is not weakness, but the highest form of strength." Ashford's expression softened as he followed Richard's gaze to Clara. "Ah, yes, the healer whose reputation for both skill and kindness has spread throughout the rebellion. She has saved lives on both sides of this conflict, treating wounded rebels and royal soldiers with equal care." The revelation struck Richard with sudden understanding. Clara's healing work had extended beyond the village to encompass anyone who needed aid, regardless of their political affiliations. She had been serving something larger than any faction or cause, the simple principle that suffering called to those who would ease it. The situation, Ashford continued, gesturing toward a map spread on the church altar, requires careful coordination. Sir Gareth commands perhaps 60 men, well equipped and motivated by promise of reward for destroying rebel sympathizers. We have 40 fighters of our own, plus villagers willing to defend their homes. Richard studied the tactical situation with professional interest. Millhaven's position in the valley offered some defensive advantages, but it could not withstand a sustained assault by trained soldiers. More importantly, a pitched battle would inevitably result in civilian casualties that would serve no one's interests. "Lord Commander," Richard said, "what if there were another option? Something that might resolve this conflict without the bloodshed that serves only to deepen divisions in the kingdom." Ashford raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "I am always interested in alternatives to unnecessary warfare. What do you propose?" Richard looked around the church at the gathering of rebels, villagers, and former royal soldiers who had chosen conscience over blind obedience. In their faces, he saw a reflection of his own journey from cold duty to principled resistance. Sir Gareth comes here believing he faces a simple suppression of rebel sympathizers. But what if instead he encountered evidence of the conscience, of the court, the mysterious figure who has been working within the royal hierarchy to moderate the king's more extreme policies? The suggestion created a stir of interest among the gathered leaders. Richard continued, his tactical mind working through implications and possibilities. "We know there are others at court who share our concerns about the kingdom's direction. What if we could demonstrate that this conflict represents not rebellion against legitimate authority, but resistance to policies that corrupt the very principles the crown should defend?" Clara stepped forward, her eyes bright with understanding. "You're suggesting we try to change the nature of the conflict itself, make it about justice rather than loyalty." "Exactly. But it would require careful orchestration and considerable risk." Richard looked at each face in turn, seeing there the same desperate hope that had driven his own transformation. "We would need to create a situation where Sir Gareth and his men witnessed evidence of royal corruption so compelling that they questioned their own orders." Lord Commander Ashford smiled, the expression transforming his scarred face into something approaching warmth. "So, Richard, you have the makings of a strategist as well as a warrior. But such a plan would require someone willing to place themselves in considerable danger as the focal point of revelation." Richard felt Clara's hand touch his arm, her fingers warm with encouragement and understanding. Around them, the church, filled with the quiet determination of people who had found cause worth the risk of everything they possessed. "Then it's fortunate," Richard said, his voice steady with newfound purpose, "that we have among us someone who has already chosen principle over safety, conscience over convenience." As plans took shape for what might be either triumph or disaster, Richard realized that the Iron Knight's journey was approaching its culmination. Whatever happened in the next few hours would determine not only his own fate, but the future of a kingdom balanced on the edge between justice and tyranny. The simple rebel banner that hung above the church altar bore symbols of hope rather than royal power, and for the first time in his life, Richard felt proud to serve under colors that represented something worth the sacrifice they might demand. Sir Gareth Ironwolf arrived at Millhaven with the confidence of a predator approaching cornered prey. His column of 60 royal soldiers moved with disciplined precision through the morning mist, their blue and gold banners snapping in the wind like declarations of inevitable victory. They had been told they faced a village of rebel sympathizers led by a traitor knight, and they approached their task with the grim efficiency of men carrying out unpleasant but necessary duty. What they found instead challenged every assumption about the nature of their mission. Richard stood alone in the village center, positioned deliberately where approaching forces could not miss him. But instead of the fugitive traitor they expected to find, Sir Gareth encountered a knight bearing a shield that transformed the political landscape with a single Symbolic gesture. The shield Richard carried was newly forged, its surface bearing not the Valehart hawk or royal arms, but symbols that spoke of justice served above personal ambition. A balanced scale dominated the center, flanked by a sword and an olive branch emblems that declared allegiance to principles rather than personalities. Sir Richard of Valehart, Gareth called as his column halted 50 yards from the village. Center, by order of His Majesty King Aldric, you will surrender yourself to royal justice and submit to arrest for crimes of treason against the crown. Richard's response carried across the distance between them with the clarity of a bell-tolling judgment. I stand ready to answer for my actions, Sir Gareth, but not to a king who has corrupted the very concept of justice he claims to defend. The words struck the royal soldiers like physical blows. In their experience, knights did not publicly denounce royal authority, even when facing execution for their crimes. Richard's calm defiance suggested either madness or possession of knowledge that justified such extraordinary courage. Gareth urged his destrier forward, his hand resting on his sword, hilt in unconscious preparation for violence. You speak of corruption, traitor, while standing among rebels who would destroy the lawful order of the realm. I speak of corruption, Richard replied, while standing among people who seek only to live in peace without being ground beneath the wheel of royal excess and arbitrary taxation. As if summoned by his words, Clara emerged from the church, accompanied by Lord Commander Julian Ashford. The sight of the legendary military leader sent a murmur of shock through the royal column. Ashford was known to every professional soldier in the kingdom, revered for his tactical brilliance and unstained honor. Lord Commander Ashford, Gareth said, his voice betraying confusion and growing unease. Your presence here is unexpected. His Majesty was told you had retired to private lands. Ashford stepped forward with the bearing of a man accustomed to command, his scarred face grave with purpose. I retired from service to a king who has forgotten that power exists to serve justice, not the reverse. I stand now with those who remember what true honor demands. The revelation struck the royal forces like a thunderclap. If Lord Commander Ashford, the most respected military leader in the kingdom, had aligned himself with what they had been told were simple rebels, then the situation was far more complex than they had been led to believe. Clara moved to stand beside Richard, her simple presence transforming the tableau from one of military confrontation to something approaching a moral reckoning. In her hands, she carried a bundle of documents that would prove more devastating than any weapon. Sir Gareth, she called, her voice carrying the same quiet strength that had first moved Richard to question his assumptions. Before you carry out orders that may bring dishonor to men who serve with integrity, perhaps you should examine the evidence that brought Lord Commander Ashford and Sir Richard to our cause. The documents Clara offered were copies of royal correspondence that detailed the true scope of corruption within the court. Messages discussing the diversion of tax revenues to fund the king's gambling debts. Orders to seize property from villages unable to meet impossible tax quotas. Plans to use military force against peaceful communities whose only crime was poverty. Gareth accepted the papers with reluctant curiosity, but as he read, his expression shifted from skepticism to horror. Around him, his senior sergeants crowded close, reading over his shoulder and exchanging glances that spoke of growing doubt about their mission. These documents, Gareth began, his voice tight with strain, are authentic, Ashford confirmed. Obtained at considerable risk by the very conscience of the court that royal intelligence has been seeking. The rebellion you were sent to crush is not an attack on lawful authority, but a defense of justice against those who would corrupt it for personal gain. Richard watched the impact of revelation ripple through the royal column. These were professional soldiers who had sworn oaths to defend the realm, not to serve as tools of oppression. The evidence Clara presented forced them to confront the uncomfortable truth that their Current orders served corruption rather than justice. What would you have us do? Gareth asked. The question addressed as much to his own conscience as to the figures standing before him. Abandon our oaths? Turn against the crown we have sworn to serve? Richard's answer came with the certainty of a man who had wrestled with the same questions and found peace in his decision. I ask you to honor the true meaning of your oaths. Sir Gareth, serve the realm rather than those who would exploit it. Protect the innocent rather than those who prey upon them. The morning sun broke through the clouds as Richard spoke, casting light across the village square where two visions of duty confronted each other. On one side stood the royal forces, representing power backed by law but corrupted by greed. On the other stood a coalition of rebels, villagers, and principled soldiers united by shared commitment to justice. Clara's voice cut through the tension with gentle wisdom that transformed confrontation into possibility. Perhaps the choice is not between loyalty and treason, but between serving power or serving principle. Each man must decide for himself which oath truly honors the calling of knighthood. As Richard waited for Gareth's response, he realized that the outcome of this moment would determine not only the fate of Millhaven, but the future direction of the kingdom itself. The silence stretched between the two forces for heartbeats that felt like hours, broken only by the rustling of wind through the village oak trees and the nervous shifting of horses. Sir Gareth sat motionless in his saddle, the damning document still clutched in his hands, while his soldiers watched their commander wrestle with a decision that would define the rest of their lives. When King Aldric himself appeared on the crest of the hill overlooking Millhaven, the political stakes escalated beyond anything anyone had anticipated. The king rode with a small but elite escort, his presence transforming the confrontation from a local dispute into a pivotal moment in the kingdom's history. Aldric was still a formidable figure despite his 50 years, his bearing that of a man accustomed to absolute authority and unquestioning obedience. So, the king called as he descended into the village square, his voice carrying the cold authority of 3 decades on the throne. My bastard son chooses to make his rebellion public. How touching that it requires an audience of peasants and traitors. Richard felt the familiar chill of his father's adoptive father's disapproval, but Clara's presence beside him provided strength that no amount of royal displeasure could diminish. Your Majesty, he replied, offering a bow that conveyed respect for the office without submission to the man. I choose to serve the principles that should guide any righteous ruler. King Aldric's laugh held no warmth. Principles? You speak to me of principles while standing among armed rebels who would destroy the lawful order I have spent my life building. Lord Commander Ashford stepped forward, his scarred face baring the weight of years spent serving a crown that had gradually lost its way. Your Majesty, the lawful order you describe has become indistinguishable from systematic oppression. These people seek not destruction but justice. Justice? The king's voice rose with genuine outrage. I am justice in this realm, Julian. My word is law, my will is authority. These peasants forget their place, and you forget yours. Clara moved between the two men with the same fearless grace she had shown when offering bread to the Iron Knight. In her hands, she carried something that would transform the confrontation more completely than any weapon. A simple crown woven from thorny branches, its crude construction somehow more regal than any golden circlet. Your Majesty, Clara said, her voice carrying across the square with quiet strength. True authority comes not from power imposed, but from justice earned. A crown that oppresses rather than protects has lost its right to command loyalty. She held up the thorny crown, its twisted branches catching the morning light. This represents leadership through sacrifice rather than privilege, service rather than dominance. Perhaps it is time the kingdom remembered what righteous rule actually means. The symbolism struck everyone present with powerful force. Here was a peasant girl, offering the most potent critique of royal authority imaginable, not through violence or rhetoric, but through a simple demonstration of what leadership could be when it served others rather than itself. King Aldric's face darkened with fury. "You dare a common peasant dares to lecture a king about the nature of authority?" "She dares," Richard said, stepping protectively in front of Clara, "because she has demonstrated more true nobility in her service to others than your court has shown in years of self-serving politics." The confrontation reached its climax as the king drew his sword, the blade singing from its scabbard with deadly promise. Around him, his escort moved to support their sovereign, while Gareth's soldiers found themselves caught between conflicting loyalties. But the moment that should have erupted into violence instead became something entirely different. As king, Aldric raised his weapon. Clara stepped forward and placed a thorny crown upon her own head, accepting its symbolic weight with serene dignity. "I claim no throne," she said simply, "but I accept the responsibility of reminding kings that their power exists to serve justice, not to replace it." The image of Clara wearing the crown of thorns while King Aldric brandished his sword created a tableau that spoke more powerfully than any speech about the choice facing the kingdom. On one side stood power maintained through force and fear. On the other, authority earned through sacrifice and service. Sir Gareth made his decision with the clarity of a professional soldier who had finally understood what honor actually required. He dismounted from his destrier and knelt before Clara, not in submission to rebellion, but in recognition of principles that transcended political allegiance. "I serve the realm," he declared, his voice carrying across the square, "and the realm is served better by justice than by tyranny." One by one, his soldiers followed suit, laying down their weapons not in surrender, but in acknowledgement that some loyalties ran deeper than royal commands. Even members of the king's own escort began to question orders that required them to destroy innocent people in service to corrupt authority. King Aldric found himself facing not armed rebellion, but something far more dangerous, a moral awakening that challenged the very foundations of his rule. As he stood alone with his sword, drawn against people who had chosen conscience over convenience, he realized that his authority had become an empty shell, maintained only through fear of consequences that no longer carried weight. The crown of thorns on Clara's head caught the sunlight like a beacon, its simple message clear to all who witnessed it. True power came not from the ability to command obedience, but from the willingness to sacrifice for others. Richard had found his answer to the question of duty versus conscience, and in doing so, had helped an entire kingdom rediscover the meaning of justice. 6 months later, the kingdom of Aldermere bore little resemblance to the realm Richard had served as the Iron Knight. The changes had come not through violent revolution, but through the gradual transformation of hearts and minds, spreading outward from Millhaven like ripples from a stone cast into still water. Richard stood in the great hall of Ironhold. But the chamber no longer felt like a monument to martial glory and noble privilege. The ancient tapestries remained, but they were now accompanied by simple wooden benches where villagers could seek audience with their lord. The massive dining table that had once hosted only nobles and military commanders now served meals to anyone who needed food or shelter. The transformation reflected Richard's own journey from cold duty to compassionate service. He had rejected King Aldric's offer of legitimization and royal recognition, choosing instead to use his position and resources to heal the damage caused by years of oppressive taxation and arbitrary rule. Clara entered the hall carrying a leather satchel that had become familiar throughout the region, her healer's bag, now expanded to include medical supplies donated by nobles who had followed Richard's example in choosing service over privilege. She wore a simple blue dress, finer than her old brown homespun, but still practical for the work that defined her days. "The delegation from Oakenford has arrived," she reported, Settling beside Richard at the table were maps and correspondence, documented their ongoing efforts to establish just governance throughout the eastern districts. Their harvest was successful, and they're able to reduce their tax burden while increasing support for the regional grain stores. Richard smiled, finding joy in news that would have seemed impossible during his days as a royal tax collector. And the medical supplies for Thornwick? Dispatched this morning with Captain Marcus. The epidemic there is contained, but they'll need continued support through the winter months. Clara's fingers traced routes on a map that connected villages, working together for mutual aid rather than competing for royal favor. Their work was interrupted by the arrival of Lord Commander Ashford, whose leadership of the reformed Royal Council had proven instrumental in establishing the new order. His weathered face bore satisfaction that spoke of a man who had found purpose in his later years. "Sir Richard, Lady Clara," he said, offering them both the respectful greeting that had replaced the rigid protocols of the old court. "I bring news from the capital that I believe will interest you both." The title, Lady Clara, still felt strange to Richard's ears, though it accurately reflected her status in the new order. The woman who had once been dismissed as a common peasant was now recognized throughout the kingdom as the architect of practical reforms that had transformed the relationship between rulers and ruled. "What news?" Clara asked, looking up from the correspondence she had been reviewing. "King Aldrich has formally abdicated the throne," Ashford announced, citing his desire to seek spiritual redemption for the errors of his reign. "The Royal Council has unanimously selected Prince Marcus as his successor, with the understanding that his rule will be guided by the principles demonstrated here in the eastern districts." The news was significant, but not entirely surprising. King Aldrich's authority had been effectively ended by the events at Millhaven, though he had been allowed to maintain the dignity of formal rule, while real power shifted to the reformed council and regional leaders like Richard. "And the prince's first acts?" Richard inquired. Ashford's smile suggested good news. "A formal pardon for all participants in what the royal histories will record as the Conscience Rebellion. Recognition of the Eastern District's autonomous governance structure as a model for the entire kingdom. And a personal request that you and Lady Clara consider formal positions in the new Royal Council." Richard and Clara exchanged glances that communicated volumes about their shared journey from that first moment when she had offered bread to a cold-hearted knight. The invitation to return to court held no attraction for either of them. Their work lay in the villages and communities they had helped transform. "We are honored by Prince Marcus's confidence," Clara replied diplomatically, "but our calling remains here among the people who taught us that true nobility lies in service rather than status." As evening approached, Richard and Clara walked through Millhaven streets, observing the changes that 6 months had brought to the village that had become the heart of a transformation. Children played in streets that no longer echoed with the fear of approaching tax collectors. Gardens flourished with vegetables grown for sustenance rather than tribute. The church had been expanded to serve as both place of worship and community meeting hall. At the village, while where Richard had first seen Clara tending the sick, they paused to watch the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. It was here that everything had changed, where a simple act of kindness had begun the thaw that ultimately melted the Ice Knight's frozen heart. "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked, her voice soft with the intimacy that had grown between them through months of shared purpose and mutual respect. "Giving up your position, your inheritance, your place in the nobility?" Richard considered the question seriously, looking back on the man he had been and forward to the life they were building together. "I regret nothing except the years I wasted, believing that duty and compassion were incompatible. You taught me that true strength lies not in the ability to command obedience, but in the willingness to serve others." Clara smiled, reaching beneath her dress to touch the simple copper ring that had belonged to her mother. But now she wore a second ring as well, a band forged from steel taken from melted weapons, symbolizing the transformation of tools of war into tokens of love and commitment. "Then perhaps," she said, "we should begin preparing for tomorrow's challenges. The winter will be difficult, and the surrounding villages will need our help to ensure everyone has enough food and shelter." As they walked back toward the cottage that had become their shared home, Richard reflected on the journey that had brought them together. He had begun as the Iron Knight, a man whose heart had been frozen by duty and loss. Clara's simple kindness had started a thought that had ultimately transformed not only his own life, but the entire kingdom. The hardest hearts, Richard had learned, truly were broken by the gentlest touch. And in that breaking, they could be reformed into something stronger and more beautiful than they had ever been before. Some revolutions, it seemed, began not with swords and banners, but with bread offered freely and love given without expectation of return.